Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with something extra special for you. It's the best recipes of 2024. That's right, from viral sensations to classics with a twist. These are the recipes that broke the internet and stole our hearts. Or at least that's what this copy says. So grab your aprons and loosen your belts, because this year's lineup is tastier than ever. And as always, enjoy. Cheeseburger garbage bread. That's right, we used to call these things stromboli, but apparently that didn't sound appetizing enough, so they changed the name to garbage bread. But no matter what you call this, it is absolutely perfect for when you're having a party, and also when you're not having a party. And to get started, we will add some sliced up bacon to a cold dry pan, and then we'll set our heat to medium, and we will cook it until that fat renders out and our bacon gets nice and crispy. And a great visual clue to look for is when those pieces of bacon start to look foamy. Right, can you see all those little bubbles on the surface of the meat? That means just about all the fat is rendered out, and we're probably close to being done. And once we do decide our bacon's cooked long enough, we will pull that off the heat and pour it on a paper towel lined plate, and we will let that drain and set it aside until we need it later. But do not wipe out the pan, since we're going to put that back on medium-high heat, and we'll transfer in our diced onions, along with a nice big pinch of salt. And we will cook those stirring in that little bit of bacon fat for about 3 or 4 minutes, or until those onions soften up and start to take on a little bit of color. And I'm using red, but you use any color onion you want. And then what we'll do once our onions are looking a little something like this is stop and add 1 pound of ground beef. And once that's in there, we'll take the edge of our spatula, or in my case, spoonula, and we'll break that meat up into small crumbles, but not too tiny. We do want to preserve a little bit of burgery texture. And besides breaking the meat up, we're also letting it brown a little bit, which is going to help improve the flavor and the appearance. And while that's happening, we can go ahead and season this up with some kosher salt, some freshly ground black pepper, as well as 2 or 3 shakes of cayenne. And then we will finish up with a few dashes of Worcestershire sauce, and we'll stir that in. And since salt always draws out moisture, don't be surprised after adding that stuff that this mixture gets a little bit juicy looking. Right, that's totally normal and nothing to worry about, since all we need to do is continue to cook this until that moisture evaporates and our pan dries out. And once that happens and our meat mixture looks like this, we will turn off the heat and we will transfer our cooked bacon back in, followed by some classic cheeseburger ingredients, which would be a spoon of Dijon mustard, plus a generous squirt of ketchup. And then last but not least, half our cheddar cheese, which we've grated up ourselves. And with the heat off, we'll go ahead and stir everything together. And I'm using sharp cheddar here, because that's what I like on my cheeseburgers. But if you like a different cheese on yours, put whatever you want. I mean, you are, after all, the Chef Johnny Cash of this edible trash. Okay, Swiss, American, Monterey Jack would all be fine choices. And that's it. Once everything's been mixed in, we will let that cool down to room temp before we use it. Or if we're making it ahead, we can pop it in the fridge until we need it. Although this is a little harder to work with cold, and you'll have to crumble it up. But either way, once our filling's done, we'll move on to rolling out some pizza dough, which we'll do on a floured surface. And after pressing that out a little bit with our hands, we'll switch to a rolling pin, and we'll attempt to roll this out into a rectangle, or anything close to the shape of a rectangle, that's about 10 by 15 inches. And yes, this works perfectly with ready-to-use pizza dough from the store. Or if you want to make it from scratch, we have about 10 different videos for different versions. And the good news is no matter which one you choose, it will work perfectly for this. Oh, and don't forget our rolling out pizza dough tip. If it's too elastic and it keeps shrinking back when you roll it, just let it rest for a few minutes in between rollings. And eventually it will relax, and you should be able to roll it out nice and thin. And as usual, once we get close to the size we want, we will stop rolling, and we will do the final shaping and stretching with our hands. And of course I could have got this into a perfect rectangle shape, but I wanted to demo that even if it's not perfect, it's going to work perfectly for this. And then once our pizza dough's been rectangled, we'll go ahead and transfer on our cooled filling, but we don't want to go all the way to the edge. So we'll leave about 1 inch to 1.5 inches on both ends and the side closest to us, and for the edge furthest away from us, we'll want to leave at least a few inches uncovered. And once we have that transferred on as evenly as possible, we will sprinkle over any of our other optional cheeseburger ingredients, which for me was some chopped up dill pickles, followed by a scattering of green onions. And then once that's on, we'll finish up with the other half of our cheese. And of course, jokes aside, the real reason this is called garbage bread is that it's usually made with stuff from the fridge that would otherwise end up in the garbage. So when you're making one of these, make sure you peek in the fridge to see if there's anything else you might want to use. But regardless of what extras you end up putting on, once we're done with the filling and we've tidied things up, we'll take a little bit of water on the tips of our fingers and we will moisten that dough all the way along that far edge. And once we've done that, we'll take the excess dough on the sides and we'll fold that up over, since we're going to make every effort to prevent our filling from coming out the ends. And that's it. We can now start rolling this up from the bottom. And as we do this, we're concentrating on two things. Okay, we want to roll this up tightly without having to stretch the dough. Otherwise, it's going to get too thin and basically dissolve. And then the other thing, as we roll, we want to make sure that dough on the sides is staying sealed. So like I said, we don't have any filling coming out. And once we get close to where we're trying to get, it's always good to stop and stretch that dough out with your fingers so that we're able to get a nice secure seal. And of course, we always want to end up with a seam on the bottom. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and clean off our surface so we don't get too much flour on the bottom of our pan. And then we will very slowly and carefully transfer that onto the sheet pan, which as you can see has been lined with parchment. And once that's been successfully transferred on, we will double check those ends are nicely sealed, plus any other fine tuning we think we need to do. And then before this goes in the oven, we'll go ahead and brush it with some melted butter, which is going to help this brown up beautifully. Plus, I don't know about you, but I do like my cheeseburger served on a nice buttery bun. So I think flavor-wise it works as well. And then speaking of burger buns, I decided to finish up by sprinkling over some sesame seeds. Except I forgot one thing. If you want to stick on sesame seeds, you really need to use an egg wash. And you can see exactly why when we try to cut this. So stay tuned for that. But either way, this is now ready to transfer into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 35 minutes, or until it's beautifully browned, and it hopefully looks like this. Oh yeah. You know what that doesn't look like? Garbage. And then pretty much as soon as this comes out, I like to transfer it onto a cooling rack, where we will let it sit and cool and set up for at least 20 minutes or so. All right, for me, the ideal temperature to serve this would be just barely warm, or at room temp, which is why it's so perfect for a party. But once that has cooled down, we'll go ahead and grab a knife and slice in. And because we use butter and not an egg wash, those sesame seeds are going to be flying everywhere, which may or may not bother you. And if they don't, great, because the butter is really good. But if they do, go ahead and use an egg wash instead. And if everything goes according to plan, we should be seeing a perfect spiral of filling. And because we took our time and properly browned the meat, we have a very attractive color and not some ugly pale gray. And as you can see, if you've cooked it long enough, that bottom should be nicely browned as well. And then I would have no problem eating this as is, but we should probably upgrade with some secret sauce, which is just mayo, mustard, and ketchup, with maybe some minced up dill pickles and green onions stirred in. And yes, I'll give you those ingredients in the written recipe. And that, my friends, not surprisingly, tastes exactly like a bacon cheeseburger with all the fixins. Italian marinated grilled cheese. That's right, by briefly marinating our cheese and include a few things we might find in an antipasto, we can easily create a new and amazing twist on the classic. And don't worry, even though this is based on a recipe that went viral on social media, it is not stupid. In fact, it's very smart and incredibly delicious. And to get started, of course, we're going to need some cheese. And I'm going to use 3 kinds, some Monterey Jack. We'll also do some cheddar, as well as a slice of provolone. Plus, to make things even more interesting, our sandwich will also include some pickled peppers in the form of pepperoncini, which we'll pair with some roasted red pepper, as well as some beautifully briny pitted green olives. And please double check they're pitted, since the ones with pits make a terrible sandwich. But anyway, that's going to be it for the inside. Now let's get to the outside, which will be a couple nice thick slices of Italian or French bread. And I decided to go with a seeded sourdough, but anything that looks like this and is about this size is going to work beautifully. And as you well know, to get a slightly bigger slice, if you cut the bread at an angle, you're going to get a longer piece. Right? That is just basic geometry. And once we have the inside and the outside to our sandwich prepped, we will whip up a very quick, simple Italian dressing, which will start with some freshly minced garlic, followed by a little splash of white wine vinegar, or I think any vinegar would work. We will also, of course, need some olive oil, at which point we'll spice this up with some freshly ground black pepper, some chili flakes, and I used Aleppo instead of Italian because they don't have any seeds. And then speaking of Italian, I'm going to put a nice big pinch of dry Italian herbs. And that's it. We'll simply take a whisk and give this a mix. And by the way, if you don't have a pre-mixed Italian herb blend, you can just do your own with a pinch of basil and a pinch of marjoram and oregano and a rosemary. All right, you know the ones. And then once our dressing's nicely mixed, we can go ahead and start grating in our cheese. Oh yeah, I said grate in, not slice in, which is how it's supposed to be done, according to many social media influencers. But I think by grating it, we're going to be able to do a much faster marination. And also, I think the texture of the final sandwich is far superior. So we will grate in our cheddar and Monterey Jack, which I like to refer to as mozzarella with flavor. And then because the provolone came in a slice, we'll just go ahead and break that up in quarters before we give this all a quick mix, which I like to do before we add our diced veggies or whatever else we're going to throw in here. Right, there's going to be a little bit of moisture on those things, which might cause the grated cheese to clump up. So let's make sure we have that dressing mixed in nice and evenly before we move on to that step. And that's it. Once we do, we can mix in the rest of the ingredients, at which point, if we're starving, we could just go ahead and build our sandwich and grill it. But this is called a marinated grilled cheese after all. So we should probably wrap this and toss it in the fridge for at least 15 minutes. Although of course you can go longer if you want. And in case you're keeping score at home, I refrigerated mine for 30 minutes before I pulled it out and started piling it up on my bread. And we're going to want to start with our sliced provolone first, so that we know we're going to have some nice even distribution. Oh yeah, everybody should have a little bit of provolone. And once that's been placed down, we'll use a spoon to transfer over the rest. And as you can see, I went vegetarian with this one. But if you did want to include some Italian meats, that would be fine. I mean, you are, after all, the Chef Giovanni of whether to add some salami. But if you do, be careful, because that can and will dominate the flavor profile. But anyway, no matter which you use, once we have everything transferred on and tucked in, we will add a generous amount of olive oil to a skillet set over medium heat, and then we'll carefully transfer our marinated cheese sandwich in, and then we'll add a little more olive oil to the top, since really the only way to screw up a grilled cheese sandwich is to not use enough fat to fry it in. So whether you're going to use olive oil or butter, make sure you use a lot. And then from here, I think most of you know exactly what to do. We will let that first side brown and crustify nicely before we flip it over. Oh, and pro tip, always flip a grilled cheese over towards the flat side. All right, if you flip it over towards the rounded side, quite often those pieces of bread will separate and cheese will spill out. And you will have what we call in the business a situation. All right, there's a very old saying I just made up. If you want it great, flip it towards the straight. Oh, and if you use a nice open crumb bread like I did, because our cheese mixture has lots of moisture, as our cheese heats up and liquefies, all that goodness kind of melts between the holes and then caramelizes on the surface, which makes an already incredible crust even more incredible. Which reminds me, one of our first viral videos ever was something called Inside Out Grilled Cheese, where we put cheese on the outside of the bread also. Well, this actually kind of reminded me of that, which, believe you me, is a very good thing. But anyway, once we're very happy with how that's been grilled on both sides, we'll go ahead and remove that to a cutting board. And we will slice in. And while I do, let's listen in. Oh yeah, that sounds exactly how we want it to sound. And I know when we were building this, you were thinking that was too much cheese. But as you can now hopefully see here, I believe it was the perfect ratio. But anyway, it looked, felt, and smelled amazing. French fries a l'assassina! That's right, we're making Assassin's French fries, which are inspired by one of Italy's most unusual and most delicious pasta recipes. And just like spaghetti a l'assassina, these spicy and very addictive baked French fries really are to die for. And to get started, what we'll do is transfer about 3 tablespoons of tomato paste into a large, very experienced mixing bowl. And pro tip, when you buy tomato paste, look for the tubes and not the little cans, since we almost never use a whole can, and the tube is so much more convenient. And then besides the tomato paste, we're also going to need some olive oil in a fairly generous amount. And then just like the famous spaghetti, we're going to add a ton of red chili flakes. I know that is a lot, but this is supposed to be really spicy, which is why we're also going to add some cayenne. And then next up, we'll do garlic in 2 forms. We'll do a good amount of freshly minced garlic, plus a little bit of dried granulated garlic, which is going to add to the savoriness. And of course, that's a very common ingredient in seasoned fries. And then speaking of seasoning, we'll finish up with some freshly ground black pepper, as well as a nice big pinch of salt. At which point we'll take a whisk and mix this enthusiastically for about a minute, or until everything's beautifully combined. And once that's been accomplished, we will stop, and we will add 1 pound of frozen crinkle-cut French fries, which I think we should add by hand instead of just dumping the bag in the bowl, since quite often there's a bunch of ice chunks in the bag, which we do not under any circumstances want in here. Plus, as we're adding them in like this, we can break up any French fries that are stuck together. And that is definitely something we want to avoid, since what we'll do next is take a spatula, and we will toss these fries until every side of every fry is perfectly and evenly coated. And if we have a bunch that are sticking together, that cannot happen. And we really, really need that to happen. And once we're pretty sure it has, we will stop and grab some Parmesan, and we'll use a microplane to grate some into the bowl. And once that surface is nicely dusted, we will take our spatula and mix that in, at which point we'll stop and repeat the whole process for a grand total of 2 cheesings. And yes, I do realize taking a piece of cheese and rubbing it against a grater for a few seconds is a tremendous amount of work, but we have to do it. Not just because I want you to use real Parmigiano Reggiano, but more importantly, the pre-grated Parmesan is not nearly fine enough to stick to these fries. So if you want these to be really great, you have to really grate. And that's it. Once our Parmesan has been applied, we will transfer that onto a parchment-lined baking sheet, and then we'll use our hands or a pair of tongs to space those out as evenly as we can. Oh, and by the way, if you're offended by the thought of using frozen French fries, and you want to make fries from scratch, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the Michael Grady of thinking using frozen fries is shady. But good luck getting those crinkle cuts, which as you'll see are absolutely perfect for this preparation. And in case you're wondering, Michael Grady is the name of my friend who gave me the idea for this. But anyway, like I said, we'll space those as evenly as possible. And once they're arranged to our liking, we will finish this up with one last dusting of Parmesan. And I was going to say this is optional, but it's not. Or it's not mandatory, but it is not optional. And that's it. Once our fries have gotten that final application of cheese, they're ready to transfer into the center of a 450-degree oven for about 30 to 35 minutes. Or until, believe it or not, they're partially charred in spots and look like this. Oh yeah, that is what they're supposed to look like. In fact, if I wasn't filming this and having to take pictures, I might have gone even a few more minutes so that they were even darker and more charred and more crustified. But these were looking just about perfect, and I couldn't resist going in for a taste. Although I'll save the nice ones for the plate, and I'll eat some of the small little nubby ones. And if you're wondering why we want to cook these until they're partially charred, as soon as you take that first taste, it will all make sense. Since when we char and caramelize tomato paste, which is already super savory, it gets even more intensely so. And when you combine that with those sweet and sour elements, and of course all that hot pepper, you have something that's just off the charts flavorful. And then for best results, we do want to serve these hot. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer these onto a plate. And then to finish up, I decided to do a little grating of Parmesan over the top, followed by a sprinkling of freshly chopped Italian parsley. And that's it. Our French fries a la Sassina are ready to enjoy. Greek beef stuffed onions. That's right. I've stuffed a lot of things. Cabbage, peppers, squash, my face. But I've never stuffed onions. And what follows is what I thought was a very delicious first attempt. And to get started, the first thing I did was add half my ground beef to a skillet set over medium-high heat, in which I'd added a generous amount of olive oil. And I had 2 main goals here. One was to break the meat up into nice small crumbles. And then I also wanted to get a little bit of browning happening on the beef. And the reason I'm doing this with only half my meat is because I wanted to try something new. Okay, I usually prefer the texture of a stuffing when raw beef is used, but stuffings made with beef that's browned first actually do have more flavor. So I'm always torn between which way to go. So I decided to combine raw and cooked, just to see what would happen. And we will cover that later. But for now, once our beef is browned, we can go ahead and add some diced onion, along with some freshly ground black pepper, some salt of course, followed by a few shakes of cayenne. And what we'll do is cook that stirring for a few minutes until our onions start to turn translucent and maybe start to take on a little bit of golden brown color. And once things are looking a little something like this, we can toss in our next set of ingredients, which includes a whole bunch of minced garlic, a generous spoon of dried oregano, followed by a couple tablespoons of tomato paste. And what we want to do is stir all this together, and we will keep stirring until every piece of onion and crumble of beef is coated in that tomato paste, at which point we'll let it cook for a minute or two, or until our mixture looks like this. And once it does, we will stop and toss in some raw rice, which for me is basmati, but I think any long grain rice would work, or really any rice for that matter. And what we'll do is give that a thorough mix, since we want all those grains of rice to be coated with the olive oil and that rendered beef fat, and any and all other goodness in the pan. And once we feel that's happened, we will stop and add a splash of red wine vinegar, as well as a cup or so of chicken broth. And we'll reduce our heat to medium, and then we will cook this stirring until our rice has absorbed all the liquid. And by the way, this part was also an experiment for me. Okay, when I do things like cabbage rolls, I almost always use raw rice, since I wanted to absorb the maximum amount of flavor from the other ingredients. But I noticed most of the other recipes for this called for cooked rice, or at least partially cooked rice. So I decided to give it a little bit of a head start here, which theoretically is going to make our stuffed onions take a little less time in the oven. Although as you'll see in here, they still took a very long time. But anyway, like I said, I cooked that until the liquid was absorbed, at which point I turned off the heat, so I could let this cool before adding it to the rest of the filling ingredients. And while we let that cool, let me go ahead and show you how to prep the onions. And for this, I think the best choice is some nice large yellow onions. And what we'll do is slice about an inch off each end. And once that's been accomplished, we will find the exact center of the onion. And with our point of the knife right there, we'll make one cut straight down. And you'll see very soon why this is one of the keys to the whole operation. And that's it. Once cut, we can pull off that papery outside layer. And then I went ahead and did 3 more exactly the same way. At which point I transferred those into a pot filled with some nice cold fresh water, which of course I had generously seasoned with salt. And what we'll do is bring that to a simmer on high heat, at which point we can back it down to medium-low, where we'll maintain a nice steady simmer, and we will cook the onions for about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the size, or until they soften up enough where we can separate the layers. And since that is going to take a little bit of time, while we're waiting, we might as well finish our filling, which we will start by transferring our now cooled beef and rice mixture into a bowl, to which we will add the rest of our beef in its raw form. I also tossed in a little bit of crumbled Greek feta, which is not traditional, but I figured how is that not going to be good? And then I finished up with a handful of freshly chopped herbs. And I went with the Greek Holy Trinity of parsley, oregano, and mint, at which point we'll take a spoon and give this a thorough mix. And if you thought rosemary was in the Holy Trinity of Greek herbs, no, that is actually part of the Holy Quartet. Although having said that, a little bit of rosemary in here would have been fine. So go ahead and add some if you want. I mean, you are after all the Zeus of your herb use. But either way, once that's mixed, we'll keep that in the fridge until we need it. And then we'll head back to the stove to check our onions, which like I said, we need soft enough to separate the layers. And I guess you could, if you want, poke these with a knife or test them with a skewer. But I could see separation happening, and they felt soft enough, so I pulled them out. Oh, and then very important, do not discard the water, since what we'll do with that is transfer 4 cups into a saucepan, and along with a few cups of tomato sauce, and maybe some chicken bouillon paste, this will be the liquid we add to our baking dish, in which we're going to be cooking our stuffed onions. And all we need to do to this is bring it up to a simmer on high, and then reduce our heat to low, and keep it hot until we need it. And that's it. Once our onions are cool enough to handle, we will pull out our filling and get to stuffing. And of course, the pieces in the center are probably going to be too small for this, but we can save that stuff to use in like 100 other things. And then instinctively, I figured I should use the longest, biggest pieces, which in hindsight might have been a mistake. because once I eventually transferred in a couple heaping tablespoons of our filling and then rolled it up, because it overlapped itself, I ended up with like a double layer of onion, which I guess wasn't a big problem. But I do think that's the reason these took longer to cook than I thought. But also, and maybe more importantly, if you use nice big onions like I did, those big outer layers are going to be more fibrous. And even after cooking these for a really long time, after everything was tender, the surface of those outside pieces, believe it or not, actually retained a little bit of firmness. So what I'm trying to say is, you only need enough onion to cover the filling. And to do that, we're probably better off using the middle pieces, which are going to be plenty long enough and probably a little more tender. But anyway, like I said, this was my first time. So I knew going in I was going to learn a few things. And by learn a few things, I mean make a few mistakes. But anyway, eventually I ran out of filling after rolling up 18, at which point I transferred those into my largest baking dish. And yes, as you can see, I ended up tearing up those inside pieces and laying those in the bottom for a little extra onion action. And that's it. We'll transfer in our cooking liquid that we put together earlier, which I probably could have just poured in instead of ladling. But as usual, I was scared to mess up my perfect rows and columns. And then for whatever reason, I decided to transfer this onto a sheet pan, just in case anything bubbles over. And then after that, I placed over a piece of foil, since I think we want to cook this covered for at least the first hour. And that's it. I went ahead and transferred that into the center of a 375-degree oven, where we will cook it until our rice is perfectly tender. And like I said, I did the first hour covered and then pulled off the foil. And I was thinking it would only take me like another 30 minutes uncovered. But I wasn't even close. Okay, my rice was not actually tender until after the 2-hour mark, at which point it looked like this, which I thought was totally worth the wait, since if you're asking me, these things are gorgeous. But to make them even more beautiful, and to give them a little bit of a glisten, I went ahead and drizzled these with olive oil, and then eventually finished them off with another pinch of herb. And after letting them rest for about 10 minutes, which was not easy, I went ahead and served one up and sliced in for the official taste. And yes, my 20-year-old steak knife is super dull, but also, as I mentioned earlier, the outside surface still retains a little bit of firmness, which didn't ruin anything. It just prevented me from getting that perfect slicing shot, where the knife goes through like a hot blade through butter. But anyway, 99% of the onion was sweet and tender, and very, very delicious, and the filling was absolutely outstanding. Okay, I think my trick of browning half the meat really worked, which by the way is not really even an extra step, since we have to saute the onions and pre-cook the rice a little bit anyway. Speaking of which, to cut some cooking time down, next time I'll probably add more stock to the rice when we pre-cook it, so that it's actually starting to get tender when it goes into the stuffing. Since while these really were phenomenal, 2+ hours cooking time is a little much. But anyway, that's it. My take on Salantourmasi. Chicken Lazone. That's right, this creamy Cajun spice chicken dish has to be one of the easiest recipes we've ever posted. Okay, there's no slicing, there's no dicing, or any actual prep at all. But despite being so simple, this really is incredibly delicious and seems kind of fancy. Plus, never underestimate the power of a fun-to-say recipe name. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by mixing up our Cajun spice blend, which for me is going to include some smoked paprika, or regular paprika. We will also do some chili powder, plus to warm things up, a little bit of cayenne, and then we'll finish up with some freshly ground black pepper, as well as some onion powder, and then last but not least some garlic powder. And once everything's in there, we'll take a spoon and give this a mix. And no, we did not forget the salt. Since after this is mixed, we're going to apply that directly to our boneless, skinless chicken breasts, which I have 4 of right here. And what we'll do is salt this generously on both sides before we apply our spice blend. And the reason I prefer this technique is because we can see and feel exactly how much salt's getting onto the meat. Whereas if we mix it into the spice blend, sometimes it's harder to control. So I prefer to season the chicken like this first, and then once sufficiently salted, we can go ahead and apply our spices to both sides. But we are only going to use about half the amount we mixed up, which is still going to be plenty to give us a generous coating. And then what we'll do is save the other half to use when we make our sauce. And then once our breasts are salted and seasoned, we can start cooking right away. But for something a little more flavorful, I do like to wrap this and pop it in the fridge for a few hours, just to give our chicken a little bit of time to absorb all that goodness. which if we wanted, we could do as long as overnight. But generally, I think just an hour or two is fine. So I did pop mine in the fridge until I was ready to cook. And then once we are, what we'll do is pan fry that on both sides in a little bit of vegetable oil, set over medium-high heat. And you don't have to, but I find a nonstick pan is a little safer bet here. And what we'll do is give that first side about 4 minutes before we go ahead and turn those over. And then we'll give the other side about the same. And contrary to what some folks will tell you, boneless, skinless chicken breasts cook pretty fast. So after about 4 minutes per side, our chicken's going to be almost, but not quite cooked all the way through. Which is perfect, because what we'll do is finish it by simmering it in the sauce that we're just about to make. So what we'll do once that second side has been seared is turn off the heat, and we'll remove that chicken to a plate for a few minutes while we build our sauce. And that will start by dumping the rest of our spices into the pan. And we'll give that a quick stir and let it cook for about 30 seconds, just to sort of wake up those flavors a little bit. And yes, even though the pan was off, it's still very, very hot. So we're only going to cook that for about 30 seconds before we squeeze in the juice of half a lemon, which by the way is not in the original recipe, but I really do think it helps balance the richness of the sauce. And at this point, we can turn our heat back on to medium-high, and we can add our cream. Plus, we'll rinse out the cup we used for that with about 1/3 cup of water, and we will add that in as well. And while our sauce comes back to a simmer, we'll take a spoon and we'll give everything a nice stir, making sure we're scraping any caramelized goodness off the bottom of the pan. And we'll check for final seasoning later, but I do like to stir in a pinch of salt now. And then once our sauce is simmering, we can reduce our heat to medium-low, and we will transfer our chicken back in, along with, of course, any accumulated juices. Right, don't forget those. In fact, in New Orleans, where this recipe's from, it is actually illegal to throw those away. Or so I assume. And then all we have to do to finish this shockingly simple recipe is simply simmer these breasts gently in the sauce for a few more minutes per side, or until they're safely cooked through. And how long exactly that's going to take depends on how big your chicken breasts were, and how far they cook when you seared both sides. But it's probably going to happen faster than you think, so I would start checking after a few minutes per side. And by the way, if your sauce looks like it's getting too thick as you're doing this, don't be afraid to add a little splash of water or chicken broth. Or cream, I guess, if you want this extra rich. So keep an eye on that and adjust if need be. I mean, you are, after all, the Gandalf of making this as good as Chef Lazone Randolph, who, yes, invented this dish, hence the name. But anyway, once our chicken's cooked long enough, we will reduce our heat to low, and we will toss in some freshly sliced green onions, trying to get those mostly into the sauce. And then you will never guess how we're going to finish this dish, unless, of course, you've been to New Orleans, in which case it's very easy to guess. And that would be by stirring in some chunks of butter. And what we'll do is use a spoon, along with giving the pan the old shake-a-shake-a. And we will blend that butter in and baste it over our chicken. Oh, and as I do that, I want to tell you about a very interesting optical illusion you're going to see here. All right, as you can see, the sauce is a very beautiful, sort of creamy rust color. But if you let that sit, that vegetable oil that we seared the chicken in will actually come to the surface and give everything a deeper redder color, which disappears as soon as you stir things in. So it's not like a problem, but I did want to call your attention to it, just so you don't think you did anything wrong. But anyway, once our sauce has been buttered and our chicken's been basted, we can turn off the heat, since this is now ready to serve. Although, of course, we really do want to taste for seasoning. And if yours is good, and mine was, we can pull that off the heat and then finish very simply with another scattering of freshly sliced green onions over the top. And that's it, our chicken lazone is ready to enjoy. Oh, and as I grab some tongs to serve one of these chicken breasts up, you will get a great look at what I was just talking about regarding this taking on a beautiful brick red color, which really is gorgeous. But like I said, is kind of a mirage, and we can see that true sauce color below. But anyway, like I said, just give it a stir before you spoon it over, and you'll be fine. And I'm going to do exactly that, and spoon some over this chicken, so I can grab a fork and knife and go in for the official taste. And that, my friends, for something that took such little effort, and like zero prep and no knife work, is so rich and satisfying and intensely delicious, that if you're new to cooking, you're going to be shocked you made it. Amish beef and noodles. That's right, as a little kid I always got excited when I heard the grown-ups talking about traveling to Amish country, since I knew that meant they'd be bringing back all kinds of amazing pies and breads. But what I wish they had brought back is this. And if you're looking for a bowl of comforting, satisfying goodness, this should be the next thing you make. And to get started, we'll cut up some beef chuck, which comes from the shoulder and is perfect because it has lots of connective tissue, which makes it perfect for braising and stewing. And what we'll do is cut this up into pieces, ideally somewhere between 1 and 2 inches in size. All right, you pick. But no matter the exact size, try to get them as uniform as you can. And we definitely don't have to trim the fat off. But if I do get to a large solid piece of fat, I generally will remove it. But I would probably err on the side of not trimming enough versus trimming too much. And once our beef is cut up, we'll go ahead and season it by sprinkling over a mixture of kosher salt and some freshly ground black pepper. And we'll give that a thorough tossing and a little bit of a massage on the cutting board. And by the way, my rule of thumb for something like this is 1 teaspoon of kosher salt per pound of meat. And while we'll definitely taste and adjust later, that's going to get us very close to the perfect amount. And then once that's set, we can head to the stove, where we have a Dutch oven placed over high heat, in which we've drizzled a little bit of vegetable oil. And what we need to do here is brown this meat very well, which is why I'm going to do it in 2 batches, so as not to crowd it. And we want to make sure we don't turn that meat until it has a very nice brown crust on it. Right, whenever we're doing simple recipes like this, that only include a few ingredients, it is absolutely critical that we use the proper techniques. And getting a beautiful brown crust on these pieces of beef is one of those techniques. And if everything's gone according to plan, we should have a beautiful fond on the bottom of our Dutch oven, which, as you probably know, is all that caramelized goodness created when we brown meat. So like I said, I did that in 2 batches. And once the second side of the second batch is done, we'll turn off the heat and we'll set that beef aside and reserve it until needed. And what we'll do is toss in a chunk of butter, and we'll turn our heat back on to medium-high, and we will toss in a very generous amount of sliced onions, along with another pinch of salt. And we will cook this stirring for about 5 minutes or so, or until the onions soften up and start to turn golden. And once we feel like that's happened, we'll toss in a couple tablespoons of flour, and we will cook that stirring for a couple minutes. And while this amount of flour is really not going to make for a thick sauce, it will add a little bit of body to the broth. And by the time we're done, as you'll see, we should have a perfect, not too thick, not too thin texture. And that's it. Once we've cooked our flour for a few minutes, we will stop and toss in some garlic powder, as well as 1 generous spoon of beef bouillon paste. And then we'll finish up by pouring in the best beef broth, or beef bone broth we can find. And we will give that a stir, and then wait for it to come to a boil, at which point we'll transfer our beef in, along with any accumulated juices. And if you're wondering when we're going to put in all the other ingredients, we're not. Right, this really is a ridiculously simple dish, which, as I'll discuss later, is kind of the secret. But anyway, once our beef is transferred in, we will reduce our heat to low and cover this, and then let it simmer gently for a couple hours, or until the meat is very, very tender, but not quite falling apart. And of course, the exact time will depend on how small you cut your beef. But don't go by time, go by testing. And once we've tested it and determined our beef is tender enough, we'll go ahead and use a slotted spoon or one of these spiderweb strainers, and we'll remove the beef to a bowl, since our next step is to boil egg noodles right in this broth. And generally, it's not a great idea to boil beef that's already perfectly cooked. So let's go ahead and turn our heat up to high, and because our noodles are going to absorb a lot of this broth, it's probably not a bad idea to add a little more in. So we'll pour that in and wait for this to come up to a boil on high heat. And once it does, we will add our noodles and give this a stir. And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to cover this as the noodles cook, but I don't, and I think if you keep stirring, you're going to be fine. And depending on the brand, this is going to take about 7 minutes to cook tender. And it's fine if you go the full time, but when I think this is about 30 seconds away from perfection, what we'll do is add our beef back in and give everything a stir, and then reduce our heat to low. And that's it. Once we have everything stirred together, and we've given that probably still warm beef a minute to heat through, we are definitely going to want to give it a taste, to not just double check our noodles are tender, but since we added some extra broth, we might need to season it up again. but I'm happy to report mine was perfect. So I went ahead and served up. And as far as garnishing goes, my Amish culinary sources tell me a generous sprinkling of freshly ground black pepper is traditional. But I was in kind of a reckless, flamboyant mood, so I also added a few freshly sliced green onions. And that's it, my take on Amish beef and noodles was ready to enjoy. Baked burger dogs! That's right, the cookout got rained out, and now you're all stuck inside. But it's alright because I'm going to show you how to make hot dog shaped burgers that we bake in the oven, which I think are really going to impress your guests, as well as probably confuse your kids. And to get started, we're going to take the finest, freshest ground beef you can find, and we're going to season it with some salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper, plus a little pinch of garlic powder. No, not garlic salt, garlic powder. Then we'll also add a few dashes of Worcestershire sauce, which has been making beef taste beefier since 1837. And no, I was not paid to say that, although I'd like to be. And then we'll finish up with 3 things I love to have with my burgers, which would be some red onion, some pickle, both of which have been diced up nice and small. And then finally a generous handful of grated cheddar cheese, which yes, we will grate ourselves, since we're not big fans of cellulose powder that coats the stuff pre-grated at the store. So unless you're part termite, do it yourself. And once everything's in the bowl, we'll take a fork and give that a thorough mixing. And while it might take an extra minute, I like this method because there's less chance of overworking the meat, which might cause it to be tough and rubbery. But no matter how you combine everything together, once we're sure everything's been thoroughly and evenly mixed, we will head over and start stuffing 8 standard hot dog buns. Right, just the good old-fashioned white bread kind. Right, we don't want anything nutritious or high fiber. We have to eat that stuff the rest of the year. And what we'll do is dampen our hands with a little bit of water so the meat doesn't stick to our fingers. And we'll divide our ground beef into 8 portions, and we will shape that on the bottom half of the bun. And we're trying to work the meat the minimum amount possible to get the shape we want, which simply means something uniform that covers the bread. And we definitely want to try to get all the way to the ends, since there will be shrinkage. And then what we'll do once our bun's been beefed is pick it up and give it a little bit of a squeeze, at which point we're going to transfer that into a generously oiled casserole dish. And we want to arrange these with the meat facing straight up and the seam between the 2 sides of our bun straight down. And if you use one of these large deep baking dishes, which are normally around 15 by 10 inches, we'll be able to snuggle together 8 of these nice and cozy. Oh, and it might seem like an odd choice to put the seam of the bun on the bottom, since that part has the least amount of bread, and the bottom of the pan is where most of the juices are going to accumulate. And it might seem like we're asking for trouble, since that part might get soggy. Well, you know what? That's what I was hoping for. Since these kind of buns usually fall apart if you just breathe on them, I figured that thin seam part was going to get soggy anyway. So I was hoping by placing that at the bottom, the other 90% of the bun would toast up beautifully, which is pretty much what happened. In part thanks to this next step, where we brush the buns with a little bit of oil or melted butter. And once we've brushed that on any and all exposed areas of the bun, we will top these with a relatively light scattering of grated cheese. Mostly for appearances, I think, since we put plenty of cheese in the meat mix. So I don't think we need too much here. But of course you decide. I mean, you are after all the J. Wellington Wimpy of whether this much cheese is a little skimpy. But I thought it ended up being the perfect amount. And that's it. Once these are cheesed, they are ready to transfer into the center of a 450-degree oven for about 25 minutes, or until our buns are golden brown and they look like this. Oh yeah, now those are some nice-looking baked burger dogs. And that's it. In real life, just start passing these out, attempting to explain exactly what they are. But since I always have to take a few pictures first, I decided to garnish with a little bit of mustard. Yellow, of course. And then after the mustard, I ketchuped. And of course, if we do a straight line of mustard, we have to top that with a curvy line of ketchup, since they should not and cannot be the same. Right, it is just not done. And then I finished up with a little bit of sliced green onion, just for a little extra spot of color. And that's it, our big burger dogs are ready to enjoy. Chicken pot pie pasta! That's right, I'm making one of my all-time favorite comfort foods, which is a baked pasta casserole that tastes like one of my other favorite comfort foods, chicken pot pie. And for a first attempt, this came out incredibly well. And no matter how relaxed and happy you already are, after you eat this, you're going to feel even better. And to get started, the first thing we'll do is pull the meat off a roasted chicken, which could be home roasted, or we can just grab a rotisserie chicken from the market. And we don't need to pull off all the meat. We are only going to pull off what I like to call the easy meat, which is basically those large chunks of breast meat, plus the easy to pull off meat around the thighs and leg. And sure, we could spend an extra 5 or 10 minutes getting every last little scrap, but we don't want to, because once we spend a couple minutes pulling off those nice big pieces, we will simply transfer that into the fridge until we need it. And then we'll take the bones and whatever meat is left in all those nooks and crannies, and we will transfer that into some nice cold fresh water. And besides a bay leaf, we don't need to add anything else. Oh, and a quick tip, before you add the bones to the water, it's probably a good idea to break that carcass apart a little bit. Okay, since I didn't do that, I had to use the tongs once it was in, which did eventually work, but it's also a really good way to get splashed in the face with cold chicken water, which unless you're into that kind of thing is not recommended. But anyway, once everything is submerged, we will bring that to a simmer on high heat, at which point we can reduce our heat to low, and then we'll simmer this gently for a couple hours, after which we will have a beautiful homemade chicken broth, which we'll use to form the base of our sauce. And yes, technically this is optional, and you could just use some broth from a carton, but this is so easy, and we already have the bones, so why not? But anyway, our stock is done, and we'll simply turn that off and let it cool before we strain it. And we can move on to what's going to basically be a chicken pot pie filling, which we'll start by melting an entire stick of butter over medium-high heat in a pot, to which we will add our diced onion, as well as some cut-up carrot and celery. And besides tossing in our salt, what we'll do is cook this stirring for about 5 minutes or so, or until our onions start to soften and turn translucent. And once it looks like that's started to happen, we can season this up with some freshly ground black pepper, a little bit of dry thyme, some garlic powder, and then last but not least, a few shakes of cayenne, just to help ward off the evil spirits. And once we stir that in and let it cook for another minute or so, we will transfer in some all-purpose flour, and we'll go ahead and stir that in, and we'll cook what's basically a roux, R-O-U-X, for I'd say about 3 or 4 minutes, or until that flour starts sticking and kind of toasting to the bottom of the pan. And it's totally fine if it gets a little bit golden brown, but we don't want it to get too dark, which can cause an off flavor if it goes too far. So we will keep an eye on that. And once we have cooked our roux-coated vegetables for a few minutes, we can go ahead and add in 6 cups of our reserve broth, and we will stir that in, making sure we're scraping off any of that goodness from the bottom of the pan. And what we'll do is raise our heat to high, since we want this to come up to a simmer. And while we wait, we're going to sneak in one secret ingredient, which is a nice heaping spoon of chicken bouillon paste. And that's just going to give us a little deeper flavor. Since we're not just eating this stuff straight, we're going to be using it to flavor an entire pound of pasta. So we do need this to be very flavorful and highly seasoned at this point. So we'll go ahead and stir that in and wait for this to start to simmer. And when it does, as with all roux-based sauces, you will see this start to thicken up. And once this mixture does start to simmer, we can lower our heat to medium, and we can toss in some nice fresh English peas, or some thawed frozen peas, which will work fine. And we will also toss in a small splash of cream. And we'll give that one more stir before letting this cook on medium, stirring occasionally, for about 10 minutes. So that's what I did, and about 10 minutes later it looked like this. And no, it's not going to be very thick, which is good, since again we're going to bake this with a pound of pasta. And then to finish this off, we will chop up our reserved chicken into about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch size pieces, and we will stir that in, and we'll cook this for another 5 minutes or so. At which point, besides giving it a taste for seasoning, our chicken pot pie mixture is pretty much ready to use. And we can just reserve that for a few minutes while we move on to cook our pasta, which as usual, we'll do in some very well-salted boiling water for 1 minute less than the package directions. And I decided to go with a pound of shell-shaped pasta for 2 very, very good reasons. First of all, the shape is going to be perfect to catch and hold on to all that sauce and bits of vegetable and pieces of chicken. But also because chicken come from shells. Oh yeah, it's true, look it up. But really, a pound of any kind of open-shaped pasta will work. So if you feel like using something else, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the ray gun of how this should be done. And speaking of busting a move, while we wait for the pasta to cook, we can go ahead and mix up our buttered breadcrumbs. And all we need to do for that is add a little bit of salt to our breadcrumbs, along with lots of melted butter. And then we'll simply stir that together until we assume every single breadcrumb is coated with butter. And I do prefer to use the panko style crumbs, since they're just larger and will bake up a little crunchier. And then once that's mixed, we'll just set it aside and we'll go back and check our pasta. And like I said, we'll cook 1 minute less than the package directions. And then what we'll do is drain those very, very well and then transfer it into our chicken pot pie mixture. And we'll stir everything together until evenly combined. And I realize this looks very soupy now, but that's exactly how we want it. Because by the time this bakes, that pasta is going to absorb a lot of moisture, and we're eventually going to end up with what I think is the perfect texture. And that's it. Once mixed, we can transfer this into a nice large 4.5 quart casserole dish. And I'm going to use a ladle to do this so I don't splash it everywhere. Okay, in a restaurant, I would have just poured that in with reckless abandon, not caring too much about making a mess. But at home, unfortunately, I have to be a little more careful. But anyway, once we have almost everything transferred in, and we've used a spoon to distribute all the ingredients as evenly as we can, we'll go ahead and top that with our buttered breadcrumbs. And once we do have those transferred on top, I think we should take the tip of the spoon and give the surface the old poka, just to push a little bit of that crumb into the surface. All right, for these kind of crumb toppings, I always think it's a good idea if the top's not too smooth. And that's it. This is now ready to transfer into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 45 to 60 minutes, or until our casserole is bubbling around the edge and our crumb topping is golden brown and it looks like this. Old-fashioned fried hot water cornbread. That's right. When I started researching this recipe, I saw people calling it the most southern of all the southern cornbreads, which I didn't really understand, but then I started making it. And it actually made sense. And it is definitely my favorite new way to eat cornbread. And to get started, we will mix up our dry ingredients, which of course will include some cornmeal. And we're supposed to use finely ground, but after some testing, I decided I preferred the texture of the medium grind, but either works. And then to that we will add some all-purpose flour, a little bit of sugar, some salt of course, and then we'll finish up with some baking powder, which is definitely not the same thing as baking soda. So double check you got the right one. And that's it. Once everything's in, we'll take a whisk, and we will whisk, and we will keep whisking until everything's thoroughly combined. At which point we'll stop and pour in the star of the show, some very, very hot water. As in water I've brought to a simmer in a tea kettle. And for 2 cups of cornmeal, I find about 1.5 cups of water to be perfect. Although this really does vary, recipe to recipe. Whereas some use less for a stiffer dough, whereas some use a lot more, and they actually have to spoon this into the hot oil like a batter. But either way, we'll go ahead and take a spoon and carefully mix this all together, starting very slowly at first, so you don't splash out the water and burn yourself, and also throw off your measurements. And once we do have this all thoroughly and thoughtfully mixed, while this is still warm, we'll toss in the last ingredient, which is an optional chunk of butter, and we'll go ahead and mix that until it disappears. And no, not everybody likes to add fat to this dough. Or if they do, they'll use something like bacon grease or lard. Or if you're one of these bearded hipster chefs, maybe some duck fat. But anyway, you decide. I mean, you are after all the Valeries of making this with more calories. But either way, once we have everything mixed up, we'll go ahead and divide this into 8 equal portions. And for that, I like to use this ice cream scoop, which is fast and easy. And a good way to keep these all nice and uniform. Plus, since we're already starting with a nice round shape, it's going to give us a head start as we eventually form these into patties. Oh, and that parchment paper you see on the pan is not just to make cleanup easier. As you'll see, that's going to make it easier to pick these up once they're chilled. But before we pop these in the fridge, we'll go ahead and give them their final shape. And to do that, we simply lay a piece of plastic over the top, and then we'll lightly press these down until they're about 3/4 to an inch thick. And then the final step here would be to smooth out the tops, just so these fry nice and evenly and have a little more of a uniform look. So that's exactly what I did before I popped them in the fridge for about an hour, which is going to allow them to firm up a little bit. Although I should mention you can transfer the dough right from the bowl to the fryer, which is how a lot of people do it. But I've tried it both ways and find this works out a little bit better. And that's it. With the help of the parchment paper, we will flip these over onto our hand. And then we'll head to the stove and transfer this into some 350-degree oil. But not directly, that's too dangerous. I recommend we use a spatula to lower that into the hot fat, which I probably should have oiled first to make it slide off easier. But anyway, no matter what method you use, as long as you don't burn yourself, you did it right. And unless you lay these on top of each other, you should not have a problem with them sticking together. But to hedge our bets, we can always poke around with the edge of the spatula to make sure. And that's it, we'll simply fry these for about 3 minutes per side, or until they've cooked through and browned up beautifully. And yes, of course, because I'm filming, one of them decided to puff up due to some kind of air pocket in the middle, which did not happen to any of the other ones, or in any of the test batches. But anyway, I can't even pretend to be concerned. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, you can totally shallow fry these in like just a ½ inch of oil, which I did for one batch and it worked out fine. But anytime we deep fry, the more oil we have, the easier things are going to be. And that's it. After giving the second side about 3 minutes, I went ahead and transferred those onto a rack, at which point I fried up the other 4. And as you can see, every single one is the exact same shape and size, except for those couple that aren't. But as they probably say in the South, close enough for cornbread. And then it wasn't easy, but I let those cool for about 10 minutes before I broke one open to go in for the official taste. And yes, I picked the puffy one, which was still perfectly fine and had a beautiful crumb. And that, my friends, is a very memorable cornbread experience. Okay, the taste is very familiar, but having that crusty, sort of crispy exterior surrounding the cornbread makes for something that's new and exciting. Korean spicy chicken rice noodle bake. That's right, this isn't just my favorite new spicy chicken recipe. It's also my new favorite way to cook rice noodles. Or should I say not cook rice noodles? Since that was the key here, which might sound a little confusing, but all will be revealed. And all you need to understand for now is that this was incredibly delicious and very easy. And to get started, what we'll do is add some minced ginger and some finely minced or crushed garlic to a mixing bowl, over which I'm going to pour some rice vinegar. And when we start these marinades, I like the acid from the vinegar to touch the ginger, since it deactivates an enzyme that can make your meat mushy. So we'll pour that in and let it sit for a few seconds while we go grab some soy sauce, and we'll pour some of that in. And then we'll also need to add a little bit of salt, as well as some brown sugar, but not too much, because the next ingredient is a little bit sweet, and that would be some good old-fashioned American ketchup, or as the Italian server in Rome described it to me, American sauce. And then once that's been transferred in, we'll also want to add some sesame oil, followed by the star of the show, 2 or 3 tablespoons of Korean chili paste, also known as gochujang. And by the way, this brand was kind of medium spicy. Okay, some are mild, and some are insanely hot. So you may want to give it a taste first, before you decide how much to put in. I mean, you are, after all, the Chef John, of how much gochujang. And of course, you can always add more and adjust later. But anyway, once our marinade ingredients are in there, we'll take a whisk and give this a mix. And once we have that thoroughly combined, we will stop, and we will transfer in our pieces of chicken, which for me are going to be some boneless, skinless chicken thighs, which are by far the best choice for this. Okay, we can use breast, but those are so much easier to accidentally dry out and overcook. And please note as we're adding these in, we're giving them a good toss back and forth to make sure that marinade's getting into every nook and cranny. Since, as you know, boneless chicken thighs are famous for their nooks and crannies. And that's it. Once our chicken's been summarily slathered, I like to put a piece of plastic over the top and transfer this into the fridge so we can let it marinate anywhere between 1 and 8 hours. Okay, we can leave this overnight, but a short marinade seems to work out just as well. And if you're keeping score at home, I only did mine for 1 hour. But no matter how long we go, once we're ready, we will prep our baking dish by pouring in a little bit of sesame oil, and we will brush that all over the bottom before we transfer in 8 ounces of dry, uncooked rice vermicelli noodles, which are also sometimes sold as angel hair. And make sure you're using the rice noodles for this and not a wheat-based noodle, since with this technique they're going to have a completely different texture. And what we'll do is kind of pull those apart and break off pieces if need be, so we can pretty much cover the bottom as evenly as we can. Okay, it is tempting to just lay those in and not do the breaking and separating, since as you work with this, little pieces of dry rice noodle are going to be flying all over. But I do think it's worth the extra effort and that little bit of a mess to create a nice, even, uniform base for our chicken. But before we chicken, we're going to mushroom. And I'm going to be using these maitake mushrooms, which, speaking of chicken, are coincidentally called hen of the woods. Okay, apparently whoever discovered these thought they looked like a hen sitting on a nest, which makes you wonder if maybe they were on another kind of mushroom. But anyway, we'll break those up and scatter them over. And yes, of course, just some regular sliced mushrooms will work. And then after the mushrooms, we'll do the exact same thing with some sliced Fresno chilies, or of course the sweet or hot peppers of your choice. And then after the chilies, we'll do the same thing with some freshly sliced green onions. And besides the marinade for our chicken, it's the moisture in these mushrooms and onions and peppers that are going to hydrate these dry noodles when they bake. And besides giving us a perfect texture, they are going to be way, way more flavorful than rice noodles that have just absorbed water, which is what happens if you boil them first. And that's it. Once whatever else we're using has been scattered over, we'll go ahead and transfer over our chicken, which I like to do with the smooth side up. And you'll also notice as I'm placing these on, any thinner and or ragged edges have been folded underneath. And that's so these thighs cook nice and evenly, not to mention probably look better. But having said that, you could place those on any which way you want, and this is still going to come out amazingly well. And then once our chicken's been placed down as shown, we'll go ahead and spoon over any of that extra marinade from the bowl, and we'll apply that as evenly as we can over the top of each piece. And a spoon's going to do a pretty good job of getting most of that marinade out of the bowl, but it's not going to get all of it, and we really, really want all of it. So what we'll do, since we were going to add it anyway, we will pour some chicken broth into the bowl, and then we'll grab a whisk or spoon, and we'll give that a stir so that we're getting everything off the sides. And then once that's been accomplished, we will pour that into the bottom of our dish, being very careful to avoid the chicken pieces so that we don't rinse off that marinade that's sitting on top of the thighs. And I did a really good job of that until the last second when I lost my concentration. And you can see what happens, which is really not a big deal. Just don't do that to all of them. But anyway, we will finish up with one more generous sprinkling of green onions over the top, at which point this is ready to transfer into the center of a 425-degree oven for about 30 to 35 minutes, or until our chicken is cooked through, and it looks like this. I know, that does look like one of the most delicious things you've ever seen. But let's go ahead and make it look even more beautiful by sprinkling on some toasted sesame seeds, followed by a few more freshly sliced green onions. And in a few moments, I'm going to show you how to finish this properly by dressing this with a little bit of rice vinegar and sesame oil and giving it a toss. But this looked and smelled so good, I had to go in for a little taste first. And as incredibly tasty and flavorful as that chicken is, our now perfectly cooked rice noodles are just as amazing. But I know what you're thinking. Those look kind of dry. I would want more sauce. Well, you actually don't. I'm going to explain all that in a few minutes. But for now, what we want to do once this comes out of the oven is remove the chicken to a plate, at which point we'll use some tongs with maybe the help of a fork, and we will toss our rice noodles with everything else left in the dish. And once we do, I like to dress this very simply with a generous splash of rice vinegar, and or if we wanted, we could do some citrus juice. Okay, some lemon and lime would definitely work in this. And then besides the vinegar, we'll also want to do a generous drizzle of sesame oil, at which point we'll give everything one final thorough tossing. Oh, and if you were just thinking, I would have doubled the marinade ingredients and doubled the amount of chicken broth so that we'd have something much saucier. Well, you could do that, but the noodles would not come out as good. All right, I did a bunch of tests, and the less moisture you use, the better the noodles come out. And even though maybe it doesn't look like it, the noodles are not dry at all, and they are extremely, extremely flavorful. And that's it. Once we're happy with our noodles, we'll go ahead and plate some up, and we'll top that with a piece of chicken, with maybe a few more sesame seeds and green onions. And that, my friends, despite not being all saucy, is so intensely delicious and flavorful and satisfying that any thoughts you had before you serve this, that it might need more of this or more of that, will totally fade away. And you'll realize this is exactly how you're supposed to eat it. The ultimate cowboy caviar. That's right, caviar doesn't always come from fish. Sometimes it comes from Texas. But fair warning, this gorgeous crowd pleaser is very addictive, and once you start eating, it's hard to stop. In fact, I've seen people at a party look at a bowl of this and say, "I wish I knew how to quit you." But you know what? They can't. It's too good. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our dressing, which for me includes some avocado oil, to which I'm going to add some rice vinegar, plus the juice of 1 large lime. And I think avocado oil is a great choice here, but any neutral vegetable oil will work. And yes, it is true that most Cowboy caviar recipes just tell you to toss in some store-bought Italian dressing. But we're doing the ultimate Cowboy caviar. So we're going to take a couple extra minutes and make this from scratch. So we can add things like freshly minced garlic, plus a little bit of garlic powder. Oh yeah, garlic in 2 forms. One for fresh intensity, and one for that subtle savoriness. And then we'll season this up with some salt, as well as a little touch of sugar, followed by some ground cumin, some smoked paprika, and then last but not least, a little bit of ground chipotle for that irresistible smoky heat. And that's going to be pretty much it for this very simple dressing. And sure, if you just like the people coming over to eat this, some bottled Italian salad dressing from the store is probably fine. But if you love them, a custom designed dressing like this is going to be so much better. And once we have that mixed up, we can start adding our caviar ingredients, beginning with the peppers. And besides the dressing, another reason we're calling this the ultimate Cowboy caviar is because we're using peppers in 3 different forms. Okay, I like to combine fresh peppers, like this Anaheim and beautiful bells, as well as some roasted peppers, plus some kind of pickled peppers, which I have here in the form of jalapeno. And before we toss those in the bowl, let me give you a great time-saving tip for cutting your peppers. If you cut off the ends like this and set those aside, and then you simply stand the pepper up on its end and cut straight down, just slicing off the good parts, everything's going to be simpler. And what we're doing here is creating these nice flat square pieces of pepper, which are then very simple and easy to cut into strips, and then turn and cut into a nice neat dice. Okay, what takes people without great knife skills the most time is cutting all those curvaceous parts. So what I do is not cut those. You know what I do with those? I eat them. Those make a delicious, refreshing, and pretty good for you snack as you work. All right, if you want to take the extra time and slice those parts up too, feel free. I mean, you are after all the Jake Gyllenhaal of this Cowboy caviar, y'all. So do it how you want, but that's my system. But anyway, like I said, I'm going to toss in some diced fresh bell pepper and a little bit of Anaheim, plus those sharp, acidic, slightly spicy jalapeno rings, along with those beautiful, soft, bittersweet roasted red peppers. And then we'll also add some diced red onion that we should rinse under cold water to remove a lot of the sharpness. And then as far as I'm concerned, this must include some black beans, plus some black-eyed peas, and both of those have been drained and rinsed. And by the way, if you've never had black-eyed peas, this is the recipe to try them in. And then we'll finish up with some frozen sweet corn, or fresh if you have it. Plus, last but not least, some diced tomato. And that's it. We'll take a spoon and give this a very thorough mix. And you don't have to, but I did take the extra 5 minutes and slice up some fresh tomato. All right, most recipes just call for canned. But again, if we're doing the ultimate Cowboy caviar, I think we really want to go fresh here, since it will definitely make this taste better. But anyway, what we'll do is give that a very thorough mix before we wrap it and pop it in the fridge for a few hours. All right, you can serve this right away if you want, but it's always better if you give those flavors time to mingle and eventually marry. So I did pop mine in the fridge for about 2 hours. And you can, if you want, go as long as overnight. And then once we pull that out to finish it off, I'm going to dump in a whole bunch of freshly chopped cilantro, and then we'll give that a toss and a taste. Since it might be perfect, but it probably won't be. And after sampling, I almost always add another pinch of salt. Oh, and some people do like to add some diced avocado to this, which would be fine, but I feel like they kind of get lost in this. So I'd probably prefer to save that for guacamole. And that's it. Once that's looking and tasting exactly how we want, we'll go ahead and serve it up in some type of Cowboy caviar appropriate bowl. And some folks say to drain this first, since it is going to be very juicy. But I don't. I want those juices in the bowl. Since your smarter dippers will dig down in and enjoy that element as well. And obviously, we're going to want a lot of crispy corn chips to serve with it. And that's it. What I'm calling the ultimate cowboy caviar was ready to enjoy.